Oh, we're being live streamed. Okay. Okay, so I'll just, oh, here we go. All right, we'll get started. Welcome to Flywheel, the last Flywheel of 2021. We have been coming to you virtually for more than a year now, but we've been recording ourselves for a year. So if you've missed any of our past readings, you can find them on Facebook. And I'll actually include that link on our Instagram page as well if you have some long, cold December evenings that you'd like to spend with Flywheel. I hope that you're all doing well out there. My name is Yanni Kroltz, and it's my pleasure to host Flywheel this evening. My partner is behind the scenes, Mike, and also taking care of little Margot, our baby. You are being recorded. This is being recorded, and it's being live streamed to Facebook. So if you are on Facebook Live, please feel free to share the event, to like our page. We're also on Instagram as Flywheel Reading Series, and we'd love to have you join us there as well. I want to say a big thank you to Pages Books on Kensington. They are our live host. So when we meet in person, we meet there. And we're hoping we might be able to do that in the new year at some point. If you have not yet purchased these wonderful authors' books, you can do so at Pages or at your local bookstore, wherever you might be. Calgary is very lucky in that we have some really wonderful bookstores, local bookstores. So it's also Christmas, holiday time, get your shopping done, that kind of thing. I also want to say thank you to our partner, Filling Station Magazine. They fund this reading series, and they're a wonderful, wonderful magazine publishing experimental writing and art. You can find them at fillingstation.ca, and you can subscribe. They're also accepting submissions for their issue on Play until February 15th, 2022. So if you're a writer or if you know writers in your life who might be interested in submitting, check them out. Okay, before we start tonight's reading, I do want to say that while we are meeting virtually, we would like to acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Blackfoot Nations, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. We also acknowledge the Sarsi Dene of Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda of Morley, which includes Bearspaw, Chiniki, Wesley Nakota First Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So tonight we have two readers, actually three readers. Special guest. We have Kyle Flemmer and Helen Hajnoczky with Ian Sampson. So our first reader of the evening is Kyle Flemmer. Kyle Flemmer is an author, editor, and publisher from Mohkinstsis in Treaty 7 territory. He studies digital poetics at the University of Calgary, where he is a teaching and research assistant. Kyle founded the Blasted Tree Publishing Company in 2014 and is a former managing editor of Filling Station Magazine. His first book, Barcode Poetry, was published by the Blasted Tree in 2021. Please welcome Kyle.
Thank you, Yanni. I appreciate the introduction. I'm super excited to be reading with Helen and Ian today. Helen is a good friend of mine. I'm a huge fan of her book. It's extraordinary, and it's really an honor to share some space with both the other readers this evening. Thanks also to Pages for having our books in stock, and to Flywheel, Yanni and Mike for putting this all together. Really appreciate it. The virtual event format affords some some pros and cons, I guess, but one of the pros, at least for me as a visual poet, is the ability to screen share with you. So my book of poetry, Barcode poetry, is visual. So I figured we'd start there, and I could show you some other visual projects I've been working on as well. So bear with me a second while I fire up my screen share here. I want to start with a poem. I guess it's a little ironic since Yanni just mentioned the holiday season and getting your gifts done. So I thought this might be a nice place to start. The perfect barcode for any occasion. So as you can see, this visual poem is made from a repeating line. There's 14 lines and then numerals at the bottom. And I call this kind of poem a visual sonnet. Sonnets typically have 14 lines plus a title. So if you consider the barcode's number as its title, then this is a sonnet. The numbers represent the width of each of the columns, and the two at the front indicate order in the series. It's like blocks of 10, and the two in the back indicate its position in the total of 101 poems. So this is the 50th poem. Foreclosed in the subprime of life. No news is better than fake news. I'm not going to read you the whole book. I did want to flip through a few of these so you could get a bit of a flavor for what the book is like. Most of the poems speak to the intersection of art and money somehow. I think it's this really curious paradox that all art takes some form of like resources or money to produce. And even if you're an extremely radical artist, your art has to come from somewhere. And so there's this curious overlap between the two. Yeah, I tried to use it as an opportunity to make some social critique, to work some satire in there, to mock pop songs or advertisements, and creative writing advice, or Shakespeare. So as I mentioned, there are 101 of these poems in the book, and they begin and end with sort of polar opposites. The first one says, the barcode is not a form of poetry. And the last poem is barcodes are a form of poetry. And throughout the whole project, I tried to have these contradictory statements because I think capitalism is all about contradictory statements. It doesn't really matter what the content of your message is, so long as you can put a price on it and someone stands to gain. This is one of my personal favorites. I love it when you call me big data. So this is a project I've been working on for a little over 5 years, and I published it through my own small press, The Blasted Tree, and I was able to do this because of a successful crowdfunding campaign. So I wanted to give a shout out to the visual poetry community, it's a pretty small and tight-knit community, but I feel very fortunate to have been able to put this project together with the support of that community. So that's barcode poetry. I'm going to flip over to something else that I also consider to be a visual sonnet. This is a project called Coronographic, and it is a sonnet crown. Now, some of the qualities of a sonnet crown are the first and last. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. I'm circling the last box here if you can. Okay, I'm getting some nods. Yeah. The last box here, the last line of a sonnet is the first line of the next sonnet. So each of these 10 visual sonnets all interlink like that. Now, Coronographic is a suite of visual sonnets made from images that I copied out of a star atlas. To select these images, 10 interlocking sets of 14 celestial coordinates were randomly generated by a computer. I set up a spreadsheet and I just kept hitting refresh, and it spat out these coordinates from all around the world. Then I scanned the star charts, and the grid spaces that were containing each of the celestial coordinates was cut out. And then the poems are arranged in these loose grids to form these composite views of the night sky. And as you can see, there's 14 boxes, 15 spaces. The 15th blank space was also randomized to give each of the sonnets a little bit of a distinct form as well. So stars are charted as they appear from Earth, which means our maps are anthropocentric by necessity. And that said, viewing every patch of the sky included in a single poem it's just impossible from any one place on Earth. So these poems aren't tailored to or reflective of an individual's experience. Instead, they attempt to pay homage to our place in the cosmos as a species. For me, visual poetry is a way to approach the ineffable, to capture a little of something that words cannot manage on their own. Stargazing for me is one of those most human of activities for which language is just insufficient. So in these sonnets, as you can see, the lines of sight are substituting for a line of text. And I guess we're almost through, so I'll show you all 10 of them. I quite like this one as well. So somehow captured Polaris, which is, I mean, I don't even know how many individual grid spaces there are. I could probably quickly do the math and figure that out. But the odds of getting Polaris, I'm pretty pleased with that. Yeah, and as you can see, this dotted line here is the equator. So I caught a little bit of that as well. So that is coronographic. And as I mentioned, that's a crown of sonnets. The next thing I'll show you is also a crown of sonnets. This one is doesn't have any text in it at all. So it might be a little bit more of a leap to view it as a poem. But just like the last two series that I showed you, this has 14 lines as well. And I made these using correctional fluid or whiteout on a black background. I used 3 different kinds of correctional fluid. You can see the thin lines here are like the pen. The thicker lines are the triangular sponge, which is always a challenge to apply. And then we also have the tape that comes in the dispenser. So the idea behind this series is to suggest to the history of sonnets. There's a few famous forms of sonnets, like the Petrarchan sonnet or the Shakespearean sonnet, and they have different rules. And the one that really jumps out for me is the way that they break up their stanzas. And oftentimes there'll be this 2-line couplet that doesn't fit in a different group of 4. This couplet is called a volta, and it's generally used as the hinge of the poem. And so I was really interested in the way or where you could place this 2-line couplet to give a little bit of variation to the structure. As you can see, it's kind of closer up to the top here. So as before, the last line or the last line type, let's say, is the first line type in the next poem as well. And this is actually a heroic crown of sonnets. And a heroic crown is slightly longer than a crown of sonnets in that there's 14, let's call them standard sonnets. And the 15th one is a Master Sonnet. And the Master Sonnet has the, sorry, I'm buzzing through here I can show you the Master Sonnet at the end. The Master Sonnet, this is it, has each of its lines is the first line of the preceding 14 poems. So poem 1 had the sponge type as its first line. And this is where the name crown really comes from, because it's it circles back and it demonstrates like the whole interlinked structure of the sonnets, but like from the top. At least that's the way I sort of figure it in my brain here. This was put out by a small press publisher in Ontario called Simulacrum Press. I think they still have a couple copies left. If you're interested, you can look them up. I think I have one copy left as well. It's an amazing little chapbook that's rivet bound. So yeah, if you're interested, let me know. And then I have one project left. This is the newest thing that I sort of did, and I wanted to show it to you last to sort of transition into Helen's work, because Helen's work takes up some older forms of poetry as well, particularly some very famous English poetry. And so my last project has Shakespeare's sonnets as its material. And I call this project the Heavy Crown. Crown obvious at this point. Now, this series has an epigraph from the 106th sonnet that reads, "For we which now behold these present days have eyes to wonder, but lack tongues to praise." The Heavy Crown is a heroic crown of visual sonnets made by compiling all of Shakespeare's 154 sonnets into a series of 14 composite images, plus one master sonnet, as we saw in the last project. To produce these images, 11 sequential poems were copied from the Arden edition of Shakespeare's sonnets, and then layered over one another to form these concentrated lines of overlapping text. I didn't just want to type them out myself. I wanted to copy images from a book, because there are some weird, some curious things that happen with like 15 and 16 lines, where if one of Shakespeare's lines goes longer than the page width, it wraps around. And so they're not all strictly 14 lines on the page, even though they're written as 14 lines. So the idea, by drawing attention to the fact that it doesn't actually, like some of these poems go beyond 14 lines on the page, is to draw attention to the fact that Shakespeare is mediated in print by publishers and editors. Like we're not reading it out of his diary, you know, we're reading it after 400 years of copy paste essentially. And so the form that we're inheriting from Shakespeare is almost as important as a textual object as the content is. So I have found that the Shakespeare's sonnets are a popular site of experimentation and adaptation or deformance by contemporary poets and scholars. And oftentimes these engagements just further reify Shakespeare's genius, though occasionally his place in the canon is questioned or subverted. And so this series approaches Shakespeare as an accumulation of text, a weight we inherit in form as well as content. One of the things that I like about this is sometimes the bottom lines stick out, and they like really give an identity to each of these poems. So let's get to the last one here, which is the Master Sonnet. Yeah, I tagged on the little Feeney from the end of the book, but this is the first line from each of the preceding 14 sonnets. And just for fun, this is what all 154 sonnets layered over top of each other look like. So kind of a real mess, but also you get a concrete sense of like, this is what Shakespeare's sonnets look like. Yeah, so that's my work. This project, actually, I just heard back today, will be published by Noir Z, another small press publisher based in Ontario. So I'm not certain when that's going to happen, but if you keep your ear to the ground, I'm certain we can get something like this in your hands. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of my visual work in this format today. I'm very, very excited to hear Helen and Ian read. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kyle. That's really fascinating. Excited to see that in print. Right, so our next readers. Helen Hajnoczky. Helen Hajnoczky is the author of Frost and Pollen, Magyarázni, which was shortlisted for the Stephen G. Stephenson Award for Poetry, Poets and Killers, A Life in Advertising, which was shortlisted for Expozine's English Book of the Year Award, and the chapbook Bloom and Martyr, winner of the John Lent Poetry Prose Award. She can be found on Instagram at @cozyisasometimes and online at @cozyisasometimes.com, where she shares her visual art. And reading with Helen this evening is Ian Sampson. Ian Sampson is a poet and a scholar. He holds a PhD in English from Brown University, where he wrote a dissertation about constraint-based literature in the tradition of the Ulupo. A graduate of the University of Calgary's creative writing program, he has published work in the Calgary Renaissance, among other venues, and regularly performs as a sound poet, beatboxer, and improviser. Sometimes also a medievalist, he received the Boccaccio Afterlife Award for his rendition of a story from the Decameron. He lives in Victoria. Please welcome Helen and Ian.
Thank you. So I just wanted to echo all of Kyle's things, which he said so eloquently. So pages, Flywheel. I'm going to add Ian on there, who's tirelessly and thanklessly helped me with the Middle English in this book, and Kyle, who is wonderful and whose work I love, and I look forward to talking about that after this. So, and thank you, Yanni, so much for inviting us. And I also love Yanni's work so much. She read once, several years ago, a story about a cow almost choking, and these boys trying to say, I like think about it all the time. So tense. So, yeah, Kyle too. So Ian and I today are going to read from the poem Foliage in Frost and Pollen. So I see a few of you were there at the book launch for this not long ago. So we're going to actually pick up right where we left off from the book launch. So the next chunk of the book. So Foliage is based on the Arthurian legend Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And it's sort of a Christmas New Year's poem. So I thought it would be very seasonal for Flywheel in December. And in the original, what happens is all of Arthur's court are there at Camelot celebrating Christmas, and this giant green knight storms in and is like, who wants to play a game? And eventually Gawain's like, okay, I'll play. And the game is, let's chop off each other's heads. So the Green Knight goes first. Gawain chops off his head. The Green Knight picks up his head and says, all right, now you have to come find me in a year. I'll be at my green chapel later, and rides off into the woods. So in the original, then Gawain goes to try to find him. It takes him a year before he gets close, and he ends up at the castle of this sort of country lord. His name is Bertilac, and Bertilac's like, oh, yeah, don't worry about it. The Green Knight's chapel is really close. I know where it is. We'll help you get there on time. In the meantime, you can stay here and celebrate the season with us. I'm going to spoil it, but Bertilac is the Green Knight. They're one and the same. Morgan Le Fay has transformed Bertilac into the Green Knight to sort of torment Gawain, to test him, and also to kind of needle Arthur. They're kind of always at each other. So in Foliage, the poem is written, instead of from Gawain's perspective, it's written from the Green Knight's perspective, and it's done as a kind of eco-critical poem. So the Green Knight is this sort of embodiment of the forest, come to avenge nature for humanity's exploitation of it. And let's see. So we're gonna start reading when the Green Knight's already been to Camelot, already challenged Gawain, and now Gawain is about to arrive at Bertilac's castle. So in this version that I've written, Bertilac's not the real person, like the Green Knight is the real person. So Morgan has sort of made the castle for them and all the people as a sort of illusion for Gawain to stay in. And throughout the book, and this is, I guess why it's not much of a spoiler if you read this version, the Green Knight speaks in the original Middle English from the poem, as does Bertilac. So Ian will be playing the role of Bertilac / the Green Knight, but in today's reading, it's just Bertilac that we're going to hear. So we're going to start with passes to. Oh, I should mention, since Kyle is talking about older forms of poetry, the original is written in alliterative verse, which is what it sounds like. Each line or chunk will kind of be written with a lot of alliteration, though it doesn't carry through the stanza or from stanza to stanza. It's sort of like a little chunklet or a little line. I often joke that the poet of the original is like, it's a little bit crappy. So like sometimes he does it, sometimes he doesn't. So yeah, but that's sort of the form of this one. So we wait while winter wears away and spring sprouts its sprigs. We wait while the summer sun shines, then succumbs to autumn. We wait while fall's fanciful leaves fail and fade. We wait until Yule yet again lays its veil of snow upon the evergreens. While waiting, my wife and her forest folk feast on flowers and dance to the meadow's delicate melodies, the birds and breeze, perfecting their appearance as princes and princesses for Gawain. All the while, I wait in my chapel, channeling the ancient magic of field and forest, ferns and florets up through my feet. The might of the meadow thumping through my veins until Morgan rouses me from my rumination to bring to fruit the forest's will. I offer the woods my final words of oblation, and my prayer said, we prepare for the thrill. My lady leads me to the lake, and leaning into the waves, she lifts out a new Norse axe, sharp and shiny, a wild weapon of the woods. And we leave this cleaver on the chapel altar for later in our plot. Our jaunty troop departs, traveling contentedly to our forest folly. Casting charms, my enchantress decorates the citadel for Christmas. Last, she spells a sparrow into the semblance of a spouse for me, a temptress to trick the banneret who will traipse into our castle. As my fairy informed us he would, Gawain arrives at our banquet, and I say,
Ye are welcome to weld as your leakest that here is, as your own, to have at your will and weld.
The gullible Gawain is so grateful for our hearth that he has no suspicion our mansion is spelled, or that soon the sparrow damsel will ensnare his heart. This Yuletide, it will be not the trees, but he who is felled. The next night, I begin to ensnare the knight in our net. Issuing an invitation that will embed itself in his mind, I say,
And ye shall fonda, be me five, to filter with the best ere me want they wear, with help of me friendes.
No Arthurian man-at-arms can abstain from accepting a challenge, nor can such a knight ignore a noble's compliment. To ensure the snare is snug on the soldier's soul, I say,
I wis, sir, will ye leve, me workers they better that Gawain has been my gets at Goret's own fest.
After a year of dreading this adventure and his debt, the knight here in our manor feels so secure that his fear of his fate in his upcoming fight will lead him to happily leap into our lure, where he'll be forced to face my new axe's might. In the depths of this enchanted manor, I ask the knave to stay, to celebrate Christmas in our cheery castle, and he breaks, admitting he is aimlessly ambling these lands, lost and lonely. And when Gawain whines that he cannot complete his quest without at last locating the Emerald Chapel, I laugh.
No lang they behoves, for he shall teach you to that term be the term is ende, the grain a chapel upon grund a grave you no more. But ye shall burn your own bed burner at din aise, while forth dies and verken the first of the year, and come to that market mid-morn to make a what you leakes and spina. Doles wheel a new year is die, and rees and rack a span. Man shall you set and wire, it is not 2 meal a hen.
Not sensing my subterfuge, the grateful Gawain agrees to stay, so I ask.
Jan deemed to do the data that he bidde. Will you hare this has heret this onus?
And he agrees again.
For ye have travelled,
I say, laying my trap.
to and from fair and sithen wacked me with, ye are not well worst, neither of sustenance, ne of sleep. So three knowe. Ye shall lang in your loft, lie in your ease, to morn wheel the master wheel, and to met a wende when you will with me weef, that with you shall sit and comfort you with company, till he to court turn, ye lende, and he shall early rise, on hunting will he wende.
Considering this a deal to seize, considering me his devoted friend. I feel the forest's force flowing through my form. Now I will nail down this knight like his kin would a board.
Yet fire,
I say, laying my last trap.
a forward we make. Whatsoever ye win in the wood, it wortheth to yours. On what check, so ye chave a change me therefore. Swete, swap we so, sware with trothe, where lure so limp, lere other better.
Not knowing the nefarious nature of this gamble, Gawain again acquiesces to my wager, so I ask.
Who bringeth us this beverage, this bargain is market?
And we toast to the seasonal days of feasting and fun. Him thinking me a gracious host, and yet when our deal is done, he'll regret his pact with this forest ghost. With Gawain off to bed to dream of and dread the day he will enter the enchanted evergreen glade around my chapel, while he worries and wonders what awful woe awaits him. Morgan and I make merry, our magic to manifest in mere days. At midnight we meander to the meadow by our mansion, and Morgan transforms a garland of ivy into a graceful garter of glimmering gossamer gold and glittering green glossy silk, which soon our sweet sparrow damsel will use to tempt the gent who now twists and turns in his bed. And at last Morgan takes a sprig of holly so bright, with 3 shining berries, to resurrect a beast each night, with incantations of the fairies, to seal the fate of our visiting night. Passes 3. My men and I head to the hills to hunt the hart. And seizing the stag, I hand feed the creature 1 hollyberry bewitched by my wife, so the death ideal will be but a brief semblance. Meanwhile, our sparrow sings to Gawain her song, to trick and tempt him to trust in her trill. As I kill the deer, she kisses the knight carefully. Later that night, in the manor, I give Gawain his gift and ask,
Who pays you this playa? Have he priest wonen? Have he frequently thonk thirf me craft served?
Gawain calls this death, this display of pain, this creature robbed of breath, the most majestic he's seen slain. Playing the part, I pronounce.
And I'll give you, Gawain, for be a court of covenant, ye crave it as your own.
The horseman then hands over his half of the pact, coming close to kiss me on my concealed green neck.
It is good.
I state in my stately way.
Grant mercy, therefore. It may be such as they better, and ye may brave a wolde where the one this ilk well I be wicht of your servant.
The silly soul says his morals won't let him say. I propose we play our parts again the next day, and agreeing, the knight makes his way to nod and nap. My wife then takes me and the hart outside, where she calls it back to life, using the spelled holly leaf, as if flesh lied, her magic undoing all death's strife. And whence our brother, the hart, has happily hopped off, I draw on Morgan's abdomen the 5-pointed pentacle that sustains our spell, and I plant the peck I procured on her stomach, which swells to 1/3 the size of our child, who will be born to fulfill the forest's wrath and fury. In the morning, I make my way again to the misty mounts, where I kill a boar, to whom I feed a berry, making death but temporary, whilst our sparrow kisses our knight twice. At our dinner, I say,
Nu, Gawain,
presenting the boar's corpse.
this goman is your own. I fin forward and faster, faithfully ye knoa.
He accepts it, and the bow kisses me twice. I say,
Be sign Gile, you're the best that he knoa. You've been rich in a wheel of such chaffer in ye doa.
our trade completed, I tried to tempt the tense knight to stay and try our entertainment a third time. But the bumbling brute is bothered by his bond, by visions of vines vivisecting his veins, by night terrors of trees cutting his tendons, by dread-filled dreams of me dealing him his death, though he knows not that I am in fact his adversary. Feeling the forest flourish in my soul with potent charm, I convinced the aristocrat he cannot vacate the castle, and that a good guest would give our game one last go, for joy and for good cheer of the season. He does not know he is our toy. He does not know my treason, or that his troth I will destroy. I tell him,
As I am true sege, I sicker me troth, shall shaver the grain chapel die charis to maka, lura on New Year's licht, long before in prima. For thee, though lie in the loft and latch the nase, and he shall hunt in his holt and have the touches, challenge with the chevisance, be that he shara hitter. For we have frice to thee twice, and faithfully finde they. Now thrid team a throw a best, think on the morna, mak we merry will we may, and minute upon joy, for the lure may mon lach when so mon leakas.
he'll stay, he says, relieved and persuaded that there's no harm in one more day, not knowing he could have evaded the shameful price he'll have to pay. And again, as the moon rises over the forest, Morgan restores the boar, and I bend to her belly to draw the star and impart the pair of kisses I won. And again, her abdomen swells, now to 2/3 the size of our child, who will revile the violence of man and defend the woodlands from his destruction. That night, Morgan made her way to the sparrow maid's room, and according to our ruse, presented her with the green and gold garter that will guarantee that Gawain's weakness will reveal itself. His terror of meeting me at my chapel will lead to the shameful error with which he will fail to grapple, his desire to be the garter's wearer. At first light, I ride with my knights to the ridge and intercept a fox, to whom I feed one red, fairy-charmed fruit, rendering the calamity of its slaughter temporary. After attacking the animal, I aim my course home, to return to the manor where this ruse will reach its resolution. When I enter the enchanted castle, the cavalryman caller strides to my side to present me with 3 kisses.
Be Christ.
I try to tickle his guilt.
You catch much sailor and Chevy songs of this chaffer, if you had good chapis.
He pleads that the price isn't the point if he paid his debt. But I know the dishonest deception that is making him squirm and sweat, hoping tomorrow for a safer reception when he faces my formidable threat. Concealed in his cupboard is the cincture he covets, the girdle that does not guard against green ghouls, but that will destine this dolt to dishonor and disrepute. His dim-wittedness dooms him to disgrace in the woodland. Keeping my promise to this duplicitous puerile paladin,
Mari,
I exclaim, emphasizing my integrity.
Mine is behinde. For you've hunted all this day, and not have you getting but this foul fox fella, a fend after goddess. And that is for the poorer for to pay for such priest things as ye have thricht me here throw, such 3 cosses so gore.
Gawain evades my praise. As quickly as it is bestowed, I can see his guilt weighs on him, a very heavy load. As midnight nears and the knight needs his sleep, he heaps on thanks for our hearth and happy hospitality, and asking again that, as agreed, I will assign a man to trek through the mountains and thickets and thorns with him to find the flourishing fountain of Flora's faith, the chapel, the green church, the curse that clouds his thoughts. How he ought to have sought it himself, not to have taken this trinket that has tainted his troth.
In good faith,
I say to satisfy him.
with a good will all that ever yo hicht halde shall he read.
Indeed, all I promised will be ready when he enters the chapel of my creed, when he fails to hold himself steady, when my axe falls to complete the deed. Once more under the moon, Morgan and I undertake our rite, raising the Reynard from the rest I wreaked on him. And I write on my wife's womb the emblem of our charm, the 5-pointed star that will strike strife into man's heart. With the last 3 kisses, I confer the magic that makes my child swell to full size in Morgan, who holds in her belly the hope of all the flora and fauna who fend for themselves against man's miserable mistreatment of the meads and meadows, of the rivers and highlands, the mountains and oceans. Our daughter will dash their dreams with her smoldering red eyes, burning like holly in the snow, like an inferno rising to the skies, like searing embers aglow, like the crimson flames of sunrise. And there's one more passage where you can find out what happens.
Thank you so much, Helen and Ian. That was so much fun. I really enjoyed listening to the Middle English. As I was reading it to myself, I was like, how do you say this? It's really good to hear it, and it's so much fun. So I have a few questions for all of the readers this evening. And Helen, I'm actually gonna start with you. I am curious about the role of plants in your book. The first section of your book, as I was reading it, I was kind of like, this is a bit saucy, you know, it's a little erotic, a little seductive, like what's happening? And then in the second half, you mentioned eco-criticism. As I was reading it, it almost seemed like an eco-revenge narrative, like or revenge that will be wrought in the future. I'm just really curious about your relationship to these plants, how this project came together, and kind of what your inspiration was.
Yeah, so I wrote Bloom and Martyr some time before the foliage, the Gowing poem. And so I had that one kind of waiting there, and it was in this like beautiful chapbook that Kalamalka Press made, which was really cool. But then I'm like, it would also be cool if it were in like a book, such as this one, by my book. And I was thinking about, I guess, like what to do with that, like if I wanted to build it out, like write more of it. And at the time, my audiobook hold for this book came through. So this is Simon Armitage's, I guess, translation of The Green Knight. And it was this like beautiful sort of early snow in Calgary, where it's like everything is still green, but it's like covered in snow, which is so pretty. So I think that, and I've always really loved this poem, and I always wanted to write like something medievally, sort of draw on that interest. And I think through this poem, there's that real sense of like nature being, you know, it's not this sort of like later romantic feeling of nature, which is like, oh, it's so pretty, it's so nice to be outside. It's like, you know, the forest is full of strange green monsters who want to chop off your head. Like this is, so I think these like kind of more like creepy or intense, like strange feelings about like the natural world, and specifically plants, and not just like the animals that inhabit the forest, but the forest itself really interests me. I think like, I don't know, plants have like so much personality and so much presence. It's neat to, I think, like interact with them in a way that characterizes them a bit differently than maybe what we think of when we think of flower poetry, which is usually very like pretty or like comforting or romantic in a very maybe chaste sense. Like whereas everything in this book, I think, you know, like flowers are sort of inherently sexual, like they're the reproductive part of the plant. So I think kind of delving into all those like different aspects, like maybe less sanitized, earthier feelings of plants, is where I wanted to go with this. But yeah.
Well, it was super, super interesting. Ian, I have a question for you. Do you have any tips on Middle English? Like, how do you deal with it as a reader? Or do you, could you talk to us a little bit about it?
Sure. Yeah, I think Helen remarked, my tips when we were rehearsing this was like more Swedish chef, I think, because of all the schwas. Or it was less Swedish chef, more Scottish.
Yeah. You were like, do a Scottish accent, because unfortunately I did sound like the Swedish chef from the Muppets when I was trying to do it. Like, this has been, as Kyle said, like another like nice, I mean, not a nice thing, but like when things are virtual, there are certain advantages. So Ian very diligently taught me, like, was trying to refresh my memory about how to read Middle English out loud well. And after like several lessons, yeah, I still sounded like the Swedish chef. So that's what
that was a compliment. I love Swedish chef. It's my favorite character. Yeah, I mean, the main thing that's changed between Middle English and now is the vowels. English went through a vowel shift. And so a lot of words that you might recognize, like the word my is not pronounced my, it's pronounced me. Or the word, I don't know, house is pronounced hus. And so there's a certain pattern to how all the like the oohs and the e's and the i's and the vowels shifted. So in a way, it's easier actually if you know another language that is spelled not like English, that is spelled the way it sounds, like where the vowels actually have, like in Italian, for example, where the ooh would be you would be a ooh sound. You can sort of read it that way. This is especially hard. Helen mentioned before, I don't know if it was the preamble or if it was during the show, there's like a northern dialect of Middle English. So it's even hard. Like Chaucer's a little difficult to read. This is even more difficult. And there's a mix of like, there's runic characters in there. There's the thorn and the ev, which both make the th sound. And there's a mix of French spellings, words like chevisance, which looks like a French word. It is a French word, and the more Germanic side. So I don't know, that's not really tips for, for how to read it, but I think if you get the vowels down, it sounds pretty close. And there's the guides on the internet how to pronounce Middle English vowels.
No, that's helpful. When I was reading it to myself, I was kind of like, in my head, I sound like the Swedish chef. So
perfect. That's the word. Then you're on the right track.
Having an internal experience of the Swedish chef. Anyway, so that's very cool. Thank you. Okay, I have a question for Kyle now, going back to Barcode poetry, and we go from the Middle English to money. So in as you were talking during your reading or your presentation, and as you say in the notes of your book, you talk about your book being like a response to the techno-capitalist society, and you also talk about the intersection between art and money. And I'm curious about the role of poetry, or not the role, but rather the relationship between poetry and money, because in my mind, poetry in particular has been, at least in the last, maybe not century, but let's say last several decades, has been divorced from that kind of, maybe not capitalism, but from profit models. And maybe I'm wrong. In fact, yesterday, I just happened to see a sponsored ad on Instagram from Rupi Kaur's account, and she's going on tour. So someone is making money on poetry. So I'm just curious about how you see the relationship between poetry and profit, poetry and capitalism, and how this, maybe you could touch on again how you imagine Barcode poetry to be kind of a response to or to resist it.
Sure. I mean, there's just layers to that question, right? I guess first of all, the Rupi Kaur production, like I saw that ad too, and it's a big budget production. The stage is so, like, she looks like she's descended from heaven to be like, oh, it's amazing. Like but clearly there's big money in it. And So I think that in itself is sort of an illustration of how money and poetry interact to form something else in a way, or something bigger. On a more everyday level, anybody can write poetry, and it doesn't really cost any money. You know, a pencil and a piece of paper is pretty easy to get a hold of. It's more so like putting it in people's hands and having it circulate as a poem. Publishers are concerned about selling enough copies to cover costs. They will see how many people who are following you on social media. Do you have a personal brand? And all these things sort of factor into whether your book has the potential to be a success in this really narrow market. So almost immediately questions of like, is this aesthetically pleasing enough to just exist on its own merit? Like that gets pretty readily trampled over towards, how much is the per unit cost to print this visual poetry? Like there's more and more visual poetry in the world all the time, which I love. But so little color poetry is like printed because it's so expensive to print things in color, right? And it's a real shame because, everyone has access to a computer now. We can generate things in color and share them in color, but we just can't print them in color all that well, right? So there's this real material limitation to what is possible. You're embedded in your context, right? And so my book addresses that not only through the topic of money, but because it's all typewritten. So for me, a typewriter is like an antiquated piece of technology. It was a business technology that really improved efficiencies when it came in, saved a lot of people a lot of money. But now if we use them, like it's laborious. And so something that is typewritten to look like a digital artifact is meant to sort of punk the system of digital efficiencies and cost-saving technologies and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, as you pointed out, there's some notes at the back. There's a bit of an essay. It is in part inspired by Helen's essay at the end of her first book, Poets and Killers: A Life in Advertising. So yeah, if you're interested in sort of the ideas behind the visual poetry stuff, I recommend grabbing a copy and giving it a read.
Actually, I have a question for you, and this sort of goes for Ian too, because he also writes sonnet things and things based on old things. But I guess like what is it about that like form of the sonnet and its history that appeals to you when you're thinking about like those types of issues, like that are in a way like very contemporary?
Well, I guess form does something outside of the content of the poem. Like a haiku form is very open. It's so minimal that it's about flowering and opening. It's a gesture to something else, right? For me, the sonnet has a different purpose, and it proposes something, and then it has sort of a concrete answer to it. It like opens up into a question, and then it solves it, or at least sort of gestures towards an answer. And so I like to experiment with the sonnet form visually because it asks the question, what can a sonnet do? What is a line? And then it gives you a sort of answer. And, it might not be satisfactory to your definition of a sonnet, but certainly provokes something in me.
I wonder, I guess, while thinking about my sexy, creepy flower book, thinking about sonnets too, and how there's so much history of the creepy sexual sonnet, the nice sexual sonnet. There's a lot of romantic sexual sonnets of varying creepiness depending whether or not it's Petrarch. I guess how do you see that? I don't know, do you find that history connected to the sort of ideas of capitalism you're thinking about?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things with concrete poetry or visual poetry that doesn't offer like legible text is that it frustrates the reader's desire for clear meaning and like immediately accessible meaning. And Derek Beaulieu has argued that that means it makes it really difficult to put a price tag on it. If it's frustrating, if there is a clear meaning, then you can sell it. And so, like Shakespeare's big business, the publication and republication of these volumes of his sonnets, like they're making money, or some publishers are making money off of it, right? But you put it in a visual format and you frustrate the readers, like that doesn't look like Shakespeare at all, right? Well, that's the game, that's the fun, right? But it's less easy to market that fun for profit.
It's kind of funny though too, if you think about like sexual frustration in the like in sonnets, like in the original ones, and then like the frustration of not being able to read it, like not being able to communicate with someone or be with someone with frustration. Yeah.
I really like that. I never thought about that before,
but but yeah, Ian, you are also a
I was going to ask, just following up about sonnets, to ask Kyle about, because you mentioned, I mean, there's some other experimental works that engage with Shakespeare's sonnets, and you might know some of them, right? Like Stephen Radcliffe's Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang and Jen Bervin's Nets, that are more in the sort of vein of like typical erasure poetry, where you have, words are removed to leave another poem in the middle of the text. And Jen Bervin makes an interesting choice by leaving like a grayscale version of the original sonnets. They're actually you can read the whole sonnet, and then there's like the bolded words that make the new poem. But you've done something different. Like yours is, because you're not erasing, it's like additive, you're adding layers, but the effect is the opposite. It's like, it's more difficult to read, or it's less legible than the erasure poem. So it is kind of like an erasure poem, and that the text is being erased by virtue of its superimposition. So yeah, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, how your work relates to like those other projects, or just like how you see your method as kind of like intervening, I guess, in the, the history of experimental rewritings of the
And then
sonnets.
there's like Sonnet Lebe's like work, of course, too, which is like adding into Shakespeare.
Yeah, that work was actually one of the inspirations for this one, as well as like Gregory Betts. And my thesis supervisor, Michael Elliott, has done a research project in the digital humanities using a computer to analyze certain structures in the sonnets to figure out, how formulaic they are. And it turns out they're not quite as formulaic as you would expect. Anyway, so the idea of looking at these texts for things that you would assume were there. I guess to return to Ian's question, how we can repeat a word over and over and over again until it doesn't sound like a word anymore. It doesn't, like, the meaning of it seems to slip away from the sound of it. That's kind of what I'm trying to do with these Shakespeare poems, where you put the text out there so much that it sort of loses something. It becomes unreal through its repetition. And then, of course, that makes a visual effect that sort of connects to the previous, the one with the whiteout. It's like there wasn't any text there before, but just the gesture of obliterating something makes you kind of feel like there was, right?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of capitalism, is there a market for these art objects? Would they be considered as such? Is there a way of thinking about them in a not as literature, not as writing, but as art?
Well, my feeling is definitely, particularly if you view the edition as like I made 200 copies of my book, but at the same time I published a different project that we made like 50 copies, and a very beautiful hardcover edition, and they're all numbered, and so they're meant to be like an art object that also partakes in literature, right? And so for me, it's kind of a sliding scale between mass production and limited production. And the more limited something is, the more attention to it as an object, for me, that's the end of the spectrum that really attracts me. And I do know that Helen also produces like art and small press ephemera and stuff. So I'd be interested to hear her thoughts too.
You know, it's funny because today I was like maybe in a very specific Canadian context, I was reading sort of like the Canada Council criteria for different projects today, and there's one where you can apply for funding to like put on a show, and like if you already have it planned, you can get funding for that. And but it says like you can't do it for a literary work. And so you can make an artist book, but you can't make a work of literature. And I'm like specifically thinking of a visual poetry project. I'm like, like that's a very like economic sense in which I'm thinking of it, which is like, I want to apply for money. Am I allowed to do that with visual poetry? Like, I think that's like the first thing that springs to mind for me is like, I find myself often thinking about how like some very famous artists make works that use like letters or texts, and that's like in a way, I mean, I guess because of their fame, like it seems very like readily appreciated or like recognized as a thing. But then people, when confronted with visual poetry, are often very like, what is it? Like, I don't know how to read it. I don't know how to interact with it. So it's almost like that change too between being like, oh, it's art versus it's literature. Like it repositions the viewer and like the liberties they feel they can take with it. And I often wonder about like time and visual poetry and that too. And time is money, so maybe that's the tie-in to answer your question. Which is that like we don't think of like art as having that like, or visual art maybe like even if it's a book of visual art where it's like one thing is supposed to follow another and something is supposed to happen across the course of these pages and that sort of thing. So yeah, Canada Council grants, that's my answer.
Well, it's interesting. I'm just thinking about visual poetry and how like when I pick up a book, I generally don't ask myself like, what is it for? Or what do I do with this? You know, like there isn't a question of like, how do I interact with a novel? Like I know what to do. I start at page 1 and I read through to the end and it's very clear. But with visual poetry, it's like, I can't read this. And for someone who I want to say more of like a lay person, there may just be this, you know, confusion around which is interesting, but like, what do I do with this thing? Like, is it a book? Is it art? Because I've been told, you know, specifically at the art gallery, don't touch, you know, you don't touch it. You don't interact with it. Like you look at it and you kind of pretend to have thoughts or whatever, you know, whatever you do, right? It's an intimidating object, but we know how to deal with books. So is there a tension there or that you might think of?
Yeah. That's an interesting point. I feel like I'm the kind of person who gets like very stressed out about like lineups I don't understand. I'm like, where do I pick up the food? So I definitely like understand that emotion. And I feel like my sister's an artist and she's like often mentioned to me in like a sales context where it's like people are like, if they don't know what a thing is or like don't understand like how much it might cost or like what they're supposed to do, it like, yeah, it's kind of like repellent in a way because you're like, I don't know if I'm doing it right. Like I guess that like, you know, it's an interesting sort of like social thing around the like the art or the like literary work or whatever it is that like it's like an interpersonal thing like rather than the object itself, right? Because I think that fear is like it's sort of like, are people judging me as I like judge the work? There's like that element if it's in a public situation, or that sense of like, I don't know if like someone has ever said anything to you and you're like, they joking or not? I don't understand. Like that's sort of like that same feeling of like when you confront visual poetry. You don't know what it is. I think over the years, I've developed a sense of like, and this I don't know, this might make some people cringe, but I'm like, if I like it, I must understand it in some way. And I feel that's like true of other people, where like, I feel like I read books and I'm like, I don't know what it was about or what it was supposed to mean, but I liked it. So like, I enjoyed it. That's enough for me. Like, and similarly, I think, like actually with this one too, like having the Middle English in it, I sort of wonder, because I grew up in a very like multilingual way. So we spoke like English and Hungarian at home, and then I was sent to French school. And I feel like I don't really have a flair for languages. So I feel like I'm very comfortable being like surrounded by language I don't understand. Essentially, like that's not an unusual thing in my life. And it's sort of like, on the one hand, I feel like a thing like this with like a bunch of stuff you can't read, or many people can't read, can be sort of intimidating. But my personal attitude is like, that's kind of fun. Like, it's a little bit weird, and like, it's okay. It's okay not to understand things that we read, right? Like, I think we're probably all, unless you speak many languages, like even in Calgary, you would see every day, like languages written that you can't read, like you're like Chinese or Korean, I can't read, but I see those texts often, and it's like, that's cool. Like, I don't know. It doesn't, yeah. I don't know.
You're dealing with a source text, like a story that is accessible. It's not, it's not an entirely mysterious. Like there is that, there is accessibility there.
Especially like this version of it, which has this kind of like,
it's scary.
It's the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a new verse translation by W.S. Merwin, but it's got like the original alongside the contemporary English, so you can kind of read both at the same time. So if ever you want a key to that one. But yeah, I don't know. Kyle, do you find people are like afraid of your visual poetry?
Yes, sometimes. The one that I made out of the star charts, I remember explaining that to somebody at an event, and she was involved in theater, and she explained this very radical theater production that she was working on, and it was like blowing my mind. I'm like, this is really cool. I'm all excited. She's like, what do you do? So I explained my star poetry thing to her, and she goes, no, and turned around and walked away. Like literally, she's like, no, I'm not interested in that, and just cold shouldered me right there. So it is a thing that happens. I did want the Barcode poetry stuff to be like, no, it's like a 5-word sentence just repeated over and over again. Like, you will get the message of every one of these poems. At least one of the layers will be like blisteringly obvious, like an advertisement or something like that, right? So it certainly factors in. The other side of things though too is like, now that we have Instagram and we're developing this like visual language, that like memes are so fascinating to me, because they're a combination of language and imagery, and they're like endlessly recycled and modified, and they evolve and become hybrids and stuff like that. I'm like, this is the best possible thing for the visual poetry community, because it's preparing people to read our stuff, and just not be afraid of something that's like visually freakish.
Ian, you said you worked in Old English and Middle English. Do you find that you have any in your own poetry? Are you working with those languages? Are you working with the translation, or can you talk a little bit about your own projects?
Yeah, sure. I can. I have been working on a translation of Beowulf for a long time, which is Old English, and that's in progress for the last several years. And what's fun about that, I mean, Old English really is another language. It isn't like Middle English. You can't understand it unless you study it. It's a bit like German. It's like that, maybe that level of difference. So that's given me a little bit more license, I guess, to call it a translation. It actually has to be translated into modern English, but to do it also in a way that is, more attentive to the sound of the original language was one of the goals of that project, to like echo actually some of the same kinds of alliterative structures that Helen is working with in Sir Gawain. You find in Old English, these like very heavy stresses and like kind of 4-beat lines with with alliterative patterns. So that's one project. I've worked with other medieval texts. In the bio mentioned that I translated Boccaccio from Italian. I haven't done anything with Middle English though, other than, I mean, I took classes in undergrad, so hence the ability to pronounce it, but I've never used it in a poem.
Be next project after Beowulf, perhaps. I
can't follow this one. Helen's done it now. That's Middle English is finished.
Like, we had so much fun reading together. I'm like, we should do something else medievally together.
We can do the reverse. I'll do something, and then you can read the Middle English bits, and I'll read the English bits.
Okay. Get your chef's hats ready. I guess I guess I wonder for you, Ian, too, like, what is it about like the older forms of like poetry that speak to you? Like, why the historical stuff? Because you could rewrite, I've been thinking about this. I was sort of like peering at my bookshelf while Kyle was talking, thinking about other people who write in response to or like through existing texts. So like if Sina Karas's Sylvia Plath book. So like some people go for like contemporary, but then I feel like there's this like impulse, some of us have to go like much older and like why that is, and like what is it that's appealing to you about it as, I guess, a reader and as a poet?
That's a fascinating question. I guess I would say that, whenever we're writing, it feels like whenever we're writing, there is some kind of palimpsest. Like there is already a text there. We're writing through, inherited words and images and metaphors and ways of speaking and rhetorical forms and poetic forms, whether that's explicit or not. And I feel the fun thing about going back and looking at some of these, not just old, but also like canonical, like hyper canonical texts that come up again in the language and in the literature so many times, is you're getting to work on something that is somehow part of the tradition of which you are a part. There's like a shared horizon with the text in a way. And then if it's a text that's been translated a lot, like Beowulf has, Gawain maybe not translated as much, but there's a big body of commentary around it, and its reception is quite rich. I feel like you get to sort of go in and that gives you some license to do things differently than the way other people have done them, and sort of tweak or like twist the meaning of the text a bit in ways that you couldn't if you were the first translator and nobody knew this work at all, and you gave them a sort of torqued version of it, then it would confuse people a lot, and then they may not ever go and read the original text, and so they wouldn't be able to compare. Whereas if you know the story of Sir Gawain and this Green Knight, and then you can see your twist on it and retelling the story from the perspective of the knight and everything that brings to the text, there's that comparison that's happening in the reader's mind that's really fun. So that's one of the things that draws me to it. And then also the historic forms of the language. I just feel like Old English is still in modern English, just sort of buried. And so exploring etymology and exploring older forms and older words also helps us understand the language that we speak now.
I'm wondering for all of you, we've been in a digital space now for coming up on 2 years. How has that influenced your work, or has it? I'm curious if you have written about the pandemic, or if just being in a kind of digital space exclusively, I think a lot of people have been, if that's influenced what you're working on. Anyone?
I'll go. I feel like I actually haven't attended as much online stuff as I think a lot of people have. I've kind of done like a small handful. So for me, probably the thing that's happened is that it's kind of interrupted my like participating in, or like just getting more input from other writers, like which probably is like to my detriment, because like you're just not getting that like lots of interesting details from other people, other writers, and like other ideas. Similarly, like I haven't gone to as many, I used to go to like art galleries very frequently, and haven't been doing that. So I think for my own writing, on the one hand, I have another project called The Winter Garden, which is all these sort of, I guess like, it's very similar to the Gawain thing in a way, because it's all like sort of ecological apocalypse stuff. And one section of that I was planning to be like plague, and thinking about more the idea of like germs from the ice, maybe, that might be released by climate change. So at some point I was like, well, I guess now I've lived through a pandemic, so I could write about it. But I don't know, I guess I don't find, maybe a lot of my interests as a writer aren't, I don't know, they somehow don't like link up with like what has happened to us over the past couple of years. So I feel like I still sort of have my same list of projects that I want to do. And the pandemic, both in terms of isolation and in terms of like moving online with more stuff, have not really like changed that for me much. I guess partly because it's like a lot of my interests were sort of maybe like textual, like old texts, you know, dredging those up, or like old photographs, or projects that were already half started, and maybe the part where I had to go out in the world to work on it was already done. So I feel in a way like I've kind of just been like put in a little glass jar in some ways. So I'm like still kind of working on those things. And it's peculiar actually, like Frost and Pollen was accepted in February, right before the pandemic started. So pretty much all of the work of it has been done over the course of this. And Derek Bolia was my editor, and we probably would have, so he doesn't live in the same city as me, but we could have, like, I'm not sure if like the editing process would have been different, because we could meet outside at certain points during the pandemic. You know, that was very idyllic in a way to like work on this book, like sitting outside in the forest, like spaced out from each other. So in that way, like our material conditions sort of suited the book well, as we had to like stay back from each other and outdoors. But yeah, I don't know. It sometimes strikes me as strange, like how little it has gotten into my writing, and I wonder if it might be something that comes up once it's over. If it's ever over, or if it abates in some more substantial way. Like I think, to me, the pandemic itself is still so like raw and violent. So it's hard to kind of like get a grip on like what it means yet to me. And then, yeah, the digital stuff, I have to say, I'm also just like, I'm so happy being alone all the time, which is kind of, it's an emotion some of us have. Yeah, I like staying at home in my pajamas. So in that way, I probably get more writing done because I'm not like commuting or shopping.
Great. Thank you. Kyle, have you found that it has opened up accessibility for some of your digital, some of your visual work? Because it isn't necessary. I mean, there's other infrastructure required, expensive infrastructure like computers and such, but you don't need to publish something or to, you know, pay for ink or whatnot in a digital space. Has that had any influence on you?
Certainly. The first time I showed Barcode poetry at a reading was in person, and I printed off like a bunch of stuff and just like handed it out like flyers, right? I felt kind of eccentric and mad, you know, like doing that. But this is a built-in function. Screen sharing's been normalized, and you get like the high resolution, you know, I get to beam it right into your brain, which is really nice. So I do like that. aspect of things, I will say I'm kind of like Helen in that like I also am a bit of an introvert, but I find attending things in person to be really creative, like motivating for my creative practice. And so while I will come home from an event really drained, like the next while I'll like be really gung-ho to produce stuff. And so while the pandemic has opened up a lot of space to work on things whilst being at home alone, I've sort of had fewer like kicks in the pants to get me motivated in a way. And I didn't really realize that about myself, that I'm sort of like, part of it is I like having validation from other people. So being able to share my work is really important, but also witnessing other people's stuff and being able to perform that role for them. Like really, like it just opens up something in me that's like, okay, I want to go home and I want to play with stuff and I want to make poems, right? So that has sort of been hard to reorient myself to just like, now when I like have an idea, I just have to jump on it. Like that's what I do for the next 2 days, or the energy dissipates because there's like less people to hold myself accountable to in a way. But that being said, I have all these like computer nerd skills, like video conferencing and whatever else that were totally useless to the poetry community before. And I'm doing my research thesis at the university on forms of digital poetics, and like they feel so like marginal, and they really kind of are, but in a way like they can kind of be centered a little bit more when people are really only interacting in digital environments. So it might not be a big thing at the moment, but it is validating in a way to be like, oh, my niche interests like don't go away when there's a pandemic. So that's kind of cool too.
Yeah. It's interesting, like talking about too, like going out and being inspired by other people, or like, and how you bring that home. And I think this is like really an Instagram thing too, where it's like how things are commodified, because I find like being alone so much does make me think like, why do I write? Who am I writing for? And like, to what end? That sort of question has come up for me more when I'm not like part of a community really, or like you just like even going to places where these things happen, where it's like, you know, for most of the pandemic, I feel like it's been like me alone or me on Instagram. Like those are kind of the two like art spaces for me. And it's like, I find more and more I'm trying to be like thinking about what do I really want to make? You know, I feel like maybe that desire to like make stuff has always been like something that's been with me since I was little. I was probably nurtured by my parents. It's all their fault. And it's interesting. I find the more I do that, the more people respond well to the things I make. So, you know, like probably because I have a better developed idea if I'm more invested in it and like interested in it. So in a way, maybe like this amount of isolation like has helped me identify that or get in touch with myself more clearly, just because I'm alone with myself all the time. But yeah, how about you, Yanni? You're also a writer. How do you feel like the pandemic is?
Oh God, you're asking this. I've been the one asking the questions now. It's interesting. I've had an interesting experience during the pandemic as a new mother. I have a 15-and-a-half-month-old now. So my experience would have been one of kind of like isolation regardless as a parent, and then to also have to actually not be able to leave the house and to be working on a project. I'm working on a novel. I'm finding that the experience has become like doubly and then triply and more insular. I'm finding that I'm not interested in writing about the pandemic at all in my fiction. I don't want it to come up. I'm setting my novel before the pandemic. I don't want to have to deal with, like, I don't want to have to deal with the logistics of the pandemic. But I had some pretty big like life moments during the pandemic, especially the early part of the pandemic. My father died, and then several months later, I gave birth to my daughter. And these moments during a pandemic, like I don't normally want to write nonfiction, but it is something that I'm like, I should probably deal with this in some way. So I've been working on a couple essays around that. But in terms of my fiction, I don't want to write about it, and I'm not sure I really want to read about it. Like, I don't know if I want to read a novel or a story just about the pandemic. I don't think I've come across one, to tell you the truth. So yeah, not sure. Ian, how about yourself?
Yeah, I haven't written anything about the pandemic. I don't really want to do that. Although I have been re-engaging recently again with Boccaccio, who wrote the Decameron is during the plague. It's during the Black Death, and the intro to the Decameron is kind of frightening in how many parallels there are to our current situation. But as far as affecting like my writing practice, or maybe my creative practice, the other things I do, I also do improv, and we were doing improv online, which is just weird to try to improvise online, because there's a lag and you can't see people, and you're used to moving around a stage. But I think what's cool is then those forms you start to find the ways that you can make use of the online medium, maybe in ways that being in person you couldn't, like Kyle was talking about, using being able to show images of concrete poetry. In improv, you could use things in your apartment. Somebody's cat crawls into the frame in the middle of the scene. Now the cat is a character in the play, and you just, you go with that, and it's kind of fun. Also spending more time online. I've also been doing more stuff with digital poetry, and recently getting into machine generated poetry and AI and stuff like that. So probably if I wasn't sitting in front of a computer for as long, that might not have happened. But on the whole, I still miss seeing people in person. I miss readings. They're fun.
I found I was very comforted. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Helen. I
was just gonna say, like, I feel like I have this thing where I make people feel like they have to justify wanting to see other humans. I'm like, no, it's fine. It's great.
I have to say, like, I'm an introvert. At the beginning of the pandemic, I found I was like, oh wow, a lot of my day is spent in a state of stress, like just having to take the train or interact with people, and I was like, what a relief. And now I would love to take the C train, like maybe not every day, but I'd like to get out into the world again. And because I'm still very much at home, not all the time, but still at home. So I guess I want to open it up to you three. If you have any final thoughts for the evening, any words of wisdom for us to take away into 2022. Now the pressure is on.
I'd say, like, if we want to learn a lesson from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, if a giant monster interrupts your Christmas feast and challenges you to a game, don't accept. Like, take the emotional hit of him and move on. I think that's the main lesson of this book. Be yourself, and don't let people make you do things you don't want.
That is good advice. That is wonderful advice. All right, Kyle, Ian, any final thoughts?
I have no words of wisdom, but thank you everyone. It was a real pleasure to read with Helen again, and to read with Kyle. Really curious about your work. I would love to chat more about it sometime, because I'm really into erasure and into sonnets and into visual poetry and a whole bunch of things. And thank you, Yanni, for hosting.
Thank you so much for being here. Kyle, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have any words of wisdom on my own. Of my own, I guess the best words of wisdom for 2022 I'll pass along from Kevin Stedner from an event I think Helen organized about creativity. And it's like, if you have the urge to create something, do it. Just get in there, get your hands dirty, and make stuff, because it's meaningful to other people, and it's good for your mental health, and it'll keep us all together in the end, I think. So
Yeah.
keep
And, like,
moving
make it
forward
as
and keep positive.
Yeah. And make it as weird as you like. It doesn't have to be what anyone else would make.
Thank you, all of you, for sharing the screen this evening. This has been really nice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our readers. Thank you to our audience. And thank you to all of the readers and viewers of 2021 Flywheel. We appreciate you being here in our digital space. We'll see what happens in 2022. We might be back in some capacity at Pages. We'll see what happens. And if not, in person, we'll be back online. So do keep an eye on our social media. I want to say happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and stay safe and be creative. All right. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much.